There is a particular cruelty in being forgotten by someone who promised to remember you forever, and Eleanor Ashworth had learned this truth in the most public of fashions, in the most humiliating of circumstances, on what should have been the most triumphant evening of her young life. Now, 3 years later, she sat in the window seat of her family's modest townhouse in an unfashionable corner of London, watching the spring rain streak down glass that needed cleaning, feeling the chill of a room where the fire had been allowed to die, because coal cost money, and money was something the Ashworths no longer possessed in abundance. Her fingers rose, as they so often did in moments of reflection, to touch the hollow of her throat, where a gold locket had once rested, a locket containing a miniature portrait and a lock of golden hair, tokens of a love she had believed as permanent as the stars, and which had proven as insubstantial as morning mist. The locket was gone now, returned to its giver with what dignity she could muster, and yet her hand still sought it like a tongue seeking a missing tooth, probing the absence, remembering the pain. She was 24 years old, and she felt ancient. The midsummer ball of 3 years past lived in her memory with a vividness that time had done nothing to diminish. The heat of 500 candles blazing in crystal chandeliers, the press of bodies in silk and satin, the sweet strains of the orchestra playing a waltz she had danced with Lord Clarence Pemberton not an hour before he destroyed her. She remembered the exact sensation of her cream-coloured gown against her skin, the way her chestnut hair had been dressed with tiny pearls that caught the light, the flutter of anticipation in her chest, because surely tonight, surely at last, he would speak to her father and make their understanding official. Instead, she had stood near the refreshment table, accepting a glass of lemonade from a footman, when she heard his voice carrying across the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had never known rejection. "I am delighted to announce my engagement to Miss Augusta Stratton." The glass had slipped from Eleanor's fingers. She remembered the crash of crystal on marble, the cold splash of lemonade against her hem, the way every head in her vicinity had turned first toward the sound, and then, with dawning comprehension, and something very like pity, toward her stricken face. She had not wept. She had not screamed. She had stood perfectly still as the world rearranged itself around her, as the future she had been promised dissolved like sugar in rain, and when she had finally gathered the courage to approach him afterward, seeking explanation, seeking some word that might make sense of this betrayal, he had laughed, actually laughed, and said within hearing of a dozen eager listeners, "Surely you did not think I was serious? A man of my position requires a wife of fortune, not a pretty face with empty pockets. You were merely pleasant company while I waited for better prospects." The rain continued its steady assault upon the window, grey sky pressing down upon grey streets, and Eleanor drew her shawl more tightly around shoulders that had learned to carry invisible weight with grace. She would not waste another tear on a man who counted her worth in pounds sterling. Her grey eyes, storm-coloured and flecked with silver, had darkened to slate in the dim afternoon light, but they remained dry. She had accepted her circumstances with the clear-eyed practicality that had become her armour, a diminished dowry, a reputation touched by whispers that she had been set aside, prospects that had dwindled to nearly nothing. She had accepted this. She had. The following morning brought with it a tentative offering of spring sunlight, pale gold fingers reaching through the clouds that had oppressed the city for days, and Eleanor found herself seated at the small writing desk in the parlour, helping her mother reconcile the household accounts in a ledger that told the story of their diminished circumstances more eloquently than any words could manage. Lady Harriet Ashworth sat beside her daughter, her once elegant hands now roughened from tasks she had never imagined performing in her youth. Her greying chestnut hair, so like Eleanor's own, pinned in a simple style that required no lady's maid, and together they calculated what could be saved, what must be spent, and what luxuries had long since been surrendered to necessity. In the corner near the window where the morning light fell most generously, Mr. Thomas Ashworth sat with a book open upon his knee, though Eleanor noticed that his eyes lifted from the page more often than they rested upon it, and each time his gaze found her, she recognized the shadow of guilt that he tried so desperately to conceal behind his gentle, scholarly demeanor. He had been a good man who made poor decisions, trusting where he should have doubted, investing where he should have abstained. And though Eleanor had never spoken a word of blame, she knew he blamed himself enough for all of them, for the failed investments, for the reduced circumstances, for the daughter whose prospects had withered alongside the family fortune. She was reviewing the butcher's bill, noting that they might economize further by reducing their meat consumption to 3 days per week, when her hand drifted unconsciously to the hollow of her throat, seeking comfort in a locket that was no longer there, and she caught herself mid-gesture, lowering her fingers with the quiet discipline of someone who had trained herself to stop reaching for things that had been taken from her. Lady Harriet noticed. She always noticed, but said nothing, only covered Eleanor's hand briefly with her own before returning to the column of figures that demanded their attention. It was into this scene of quiet domestic industry that the parlour-maid entered with an expression of such bewilderment that Eleanor looked up immediately, her grey eyes sharpening with concern. "There is a gentleman to see the family, ma'am," the maid announced, her voice uncertain. "A solicitor," he says, "representing His Grace, the Duke of Thornton." The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of confusion across every face. Mr. Ashworth closed his book. Lady Harriet set down her pen. Eleanor felt her heart perform a strange, stuttering rhythm, though she could not have explained why. They knew no duke. They moved in no circles where such an elevated personage might be encountered. There was no conceivable reason why one of the most powerful men in England should send his representative to their modest townhouse in an unfashionable neighbourhood. The solicitor, a Mr. Reginald Fletcher, was admitted, a neat, precise man with spectacles and an air of professional discretion, and he delivered his message with the efficiency of someone accustomed to extraordinary errands. His Grace requested the honour of a meeting with Miss Eleanor Ashworth at his London residence tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, and he offered no explanation, only an address written in elegant script upon a cream-coloured card. When he had gone, leaving the card upon the table like an unexploded shell, the family sat in stunned silence, until Lady Harriet reached across and took her daughter's hand, her eyes warm with a wisdom born of years and loss and love that had never wavered. "My darling," she said softly, "the heart that has been broken often learns to recognize true gold from gilt. You will see clearly when the time comes." The Duke of Thornton's London residence rose before Eleanor, like a monument to everything she had lost and everything she had never possessed, its Portland stone facade gleaming pale against the threatening grey sky, its windows reflecting the afternoon light with the cold indifference of wealth so vast it need not concern itself with the opinions of those who stood upon its doorstep in their best dress, a dress that had been her best 3 seasons ago, and now showed its age in the slight fading of its blue muslin, and the careful mending at the hem that only a discerning eye would notice, though Eleanor had no doubt that every eye in this household would be discerning indeed. She climbed the marble steps with her chin held high, and her heart beating a rhythm of nervous apprehension against her ribs, and when the door swung open to reveal a footman in livery, so immaculate it might have been sewn that very morning, she stepped across the threshold into a world that seemed designed to remind her of her own insignificance. Marble floors, veined with grey and gold, stretching toward a grand staircase, paintings in gilded frames depicting ancestors who had never known want, chandeliers dripping crystal tears that caught what little light the overcast sky permitted, and everywhere the hushed efficiency of servants who moved like ghosts, seeing everything and betraying nothing. She was conducted through corridors lined with treasures, a Ming vase on a pedestal, a tapestry that might have graced a medieval castle, a clock whose golden hands had marked the hours of generations, until at last she stood before a heavy oak door, and the footman announced her name with the solemnity of a herald presenting a petitioner before a king, and Eleanor Ashworth, daughter of a ruined man, walked into the Duke of Thornton's study to meet her fate. He stood before the window with his back to her, a silhouette of power and privilege against the grey light, and when he turned, Eleanor felt the breath catch in her throat, not from fear, though there was something fearsome in him, but from the sheer, overwhelming presence of a man who seemed to fill the room simply by existing within it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built with the powerful frame of someone who rode hard and worked alongside his tenants rather than leaving such matters to stewards, and his face was stern, unsmiling, carved from granite and shadow with a jaw that might have been chiseled by a sculptor seeking to capture the essence of aristocratic authority. But it was his eyes that arrested her. Midnight blue, dark as a winter sea, revealing nothing of the thoughts that moved behind them as they swept over her, with an assessment so thorough she felt he had catalogued every mended seam, every faded thread, every evidence of her reduced circumstances, and yet when his gaze met hers and lingered upon her grey eyes flecked with silver, something flickered in those depths, too quickly to name, before his expression shuttered once more into impenetrable reserve. He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of him, sandalwood and cedar, with an undertone of leather from riding gloves, and something in her chest tightened with an awareness she had not expected and did not welcome. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was a deep baritone, clipped and cool, wasting no words on pleasantries. "I shall not insult your intelligence with excessive preamble. I require a wife, and I believe you may suit my purposes." She stared at him, her hand rising involuntarily toward the hollow of her throat before she caught herself and lowered it, and he continued with brutal directness, explaining that he had observed her at various social functions, that he knew of her circumstances and her reputation, that he was offering a business arrangement, his name and fortune in exchange for a duchess who would manage his homes and present well in society. "I have no interest in romance, Miss Ashworth," he said, and his jaw clenched as he looked away toward a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and his own midnight gaze. "I am offering you security. Nothing more." And Eleanor, standing in that grand study surrounded by wealth beyond imagining, felt something stir beneath her carefully cultivated resignation. Not hope, she told herself, never again hope, but something that felt dangerously like its shadow. Eleanor did not simper, and she did not weep, and she did not fall upon his offer with the desperate gratitude of a drowning woman clutching at driftwood, though she suspected he had expected at least one of these responses from a woman in her circumstances. Instead, she lifted her chin and met those midnight eyes with her own storm-grey gaze, and asked, in a voice that did not waver, precisely what he expected of a wife, and she watched something shift in his expression, a flicker of what might have been surprise or perhaps the first stirrings of respect, as he realized she intended to negotiate rather than simply accept. She asked about his household, about the duties she would be expected to perform, about the estates she would be required to manage, and he answered each question with increasing thoroughness, his clipped sentences gradually lengthening, as though her directness had unlocked something in him that permitted more than monosyllables. She asked why he had chosen her specifically, when surely there were women of greater fortune and higher connections who would leap at the chance to become a duchess, and his jaw tightened in that way she was beginning to recognize as his response to questions that cut too close to something vulnerable, and he said only that he had observed her dignity in circumstances that would have broken lesser women, that he required a wife of intelligence and composure rather than simpering beauty, and that he believed she would manage his homes with the same quiet competence with which she had managed her family's reduced circumstances. She asked if he expected her to provide an heir, and he did not flinch from the indelicacy of the question, merely inclining his head and stating that he hoped for children in time, but that he would not press her on the matter until she was ready, and something in the careful neutrality of his voice told her that this, too, was a negotiation, that he was offering her time and patience as part of the arrangement, and that he expected nothing she was not willing to give. When she had exhausted her questions and he had answered each one with a forthrightness that surprised her, he stepped closer, close enough that the scent of sandalwood and cedar wrapped around her like an embrace, and he said, in a voice that had dropped to something lower and more deliberate than before, "I give you my word, Miss Ashworth. I will never give you cause to regret this arrangement, and you will have my protection, my respect, and my name, and I ask nothing of your heart." Her hand rose to her throat, fingers seeking the phantom weight of a locket that had been returned 3 years ago to a man who had never deserved it, and she felt the hollow there. The absence that had become so familiar, it was almost a companion, and she thought of security, of her parents' relief, of a future that held stability rather than slow decline, and she said, "I accept your grace." She left his residence as the first storm clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy and grey and threatening, and she carried his words with her through the streets of London to the modest townhouse where her parents waited, and when she told them, her father weeping with relief and guilt so intermingled they were indistinguishable, her mother holding her close and whispering, "You will see clearly when the time comes, my darling," Eleanor made herself a promise as binding as any vow. She would be a good wife to him. She would manage his home and bear his name with dignity, and she would ask nothing more, and she would not be foolish enough to hope for love again. The wedding took place in a small London church on a morning when spring had finally decided to commit itself to the promise of summer, pale golden light streaming through stained glass windows to cast patterns of rose and amber across the stone floor, where Eleanor stood in a gown of ivory silk that her mother had somehow procured despite their circumstances, a gift, Lady Harriet had said with tears in her eyes, from a woman who believed her daughter deserved beauty on this day, even if the marriage itself was built on practicality rather than passion. Eleanor's hand trembled only slightly as Henry took it in his own, and she noted with something like surprise that his fingers were warm and steady, his grip firm without being possessive, and when he slid the ring onto her finger, a band of gold set with a single sapphire that caught the light like a fragment of his midnight eyes. His voice did not waver as he spoke the vows that would bind them together, though he did not smile, and his expression remained as unreadable as it had been in his study a week before. But his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat, and she thought she saw something flicker in those depths, something that might have been resolve, or perhaps the first stirrings of an emotion he had not anticipated, and when the ceremony concluded, and he lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture so formal, it might have been rehearsed. She felt the warmth of his mouth through her glove, and wondered if she had imagined the way his fingers tightened, almost imperceptibly, around hers. The journey to Thornton Hall unfolded in the close confines of his carriage, where the scent of sandalwood and cedar surrounded her like a second presence, and she found herself asking questions about the estate to fill the silence that might otherwise have grown awkward. Questions he answered with a thoroughness that surprised her, his clipped sentences gradually expanding into something approaching warmth as he spoke of the land, the tenants, the improvements he had made, and those he still planned, and she glimpsed for the first time the man beneath the title, a man who cared deeply for something beyond wealth and position. When Thornton Hall finally appeared at the end of a long drive lined with ancient oaks, Eleanor felt her breath leave her entirely. The house rose against the afternoon sky like something from a dream, golden stone glowing in the sunlight, windows glittering, and to the east she caught her first glimpse of a rose garden in early bloom, its colours soft against the green of manicured lawns. Henry helped her from the carriage, his large hands spanning her waist briefly before releasing her with formal propriety, and she thought of his vow, protection, respect, his name, and reinforced her own promise. She would ask nothing more. A woman awaited them on the steps, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who introduced herself as Mrs. Florence Webb, and assessed Eleanor with the shrewd protectiveness of someone who had loved the master since boyhood, and when she took Eleanor's hands in her own weathered ones, she said quietly, "The master keeps his heart locked away, Your Grace, but locks are made to be opened by the right key, and you might be surprised what doors will open for you." The first week of Eleanor's marriage unfolded like a dream from which she could not quite wake, each day bringing new rooms to discover, new servants to meet, new rhythms to learn, and she found herself wandering the grand corridors of Thornton Hall with the quiet wonder of a woman who had stepped into a life she had never dared imagine for herself, though the wonder was tempered by an awareness that these beautiful spaces felt somehow unlived in, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to fill its elegant emptiness with warmth. Her chambers were exquisite, silk hangings in shades of pale blue and cream, a writing desk positioned near windows that overlooked the rose garden, a bed so vast she felt lost in its center each night. But they held no personal touches, no evidence that anyone had ever truly inhabited them, and Eleanor found herself making small changes almost without conscious thought, requesting fresh flowers from the gardens, rearranging the books on the shelves, asking Mrs. Webb if she might have a small watercolour of her parents' home brought from London to hang where she could see it each morning. The staff watched these alterations with expressions that shifted gradually from wariness to something approaching approval, and she learned their names one by one. The footman, Samuel, who had a sister in the village, the housemaid, Nettie, whose mother had served the previous Duchess, the cook, Mrs. Barton, who blushed with pleasure when Eleanor complimented her scones, and she began to understand that this household had been running on duty rather than joy for far too long. It was on the 5th afternoon that Eleanor discovered the library, and the moment she stepped through its doors she felt something loosen in her chest, some tension she had not known she carried, because here at last was a room that felt alive, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with thousands of volumes, the air thick with the scent of leather and paper and old ink, golden afternoon light slanting through tall windows to illuminate dust motes that danced like tiny stars. She lost herself among the shelves, trailing her fingers along spines that promised worlds within worlds, until her gaze caught on a high shelf where a worn volume seemed to call to her. Its leather binding faded to a soft brown that spoke of countless readings, and she could just make out the gilt lettering that spelled Shakespeare's sonnets. The library ladder was tall and narrow, and Eleanor climbed it without hesitation, stretching upward to reach the book that seemed to hover just beyond her fingertips, and she was so focused on her goal that she did not hear the door open behind her, did not sense another presence until the ladder wobbled beneath her, and she gasped, her balance shifting dangerously, and then large hands caught her waist from behind, steadying her with a grip that was firm and sure and searingly warm, even through the layers of her dress. She knew those hands before she turned, knew them by the span of the fingers that seemed to encompass her entirely, by the calloused strength that spoke of work rather than idleness, by the thin scar she could feel pressed against her bodice, and when she twisted in his grip to face him, she found Henry's midnight eyes inches from her own, his expression unreadable, but his breath coming faster than usual, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar surrounded her like an embrace she had not known she craved. Neither of them spoke, and neither of them moved, and Eleanor became aware of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, of the warmth of his palms burning through silk and whalebone to brand her skin beneath, of the way his fingers had tightened almost imperceptibly when she turned, as though some part of him could not bear to release her, even as propriety demanded distance. The silence stretched between them, heavy with something unspoken, and she watched his jaw clench in that way she was beginning to recognize, watched his gaze drop briefly to her lips, before snapping back to her eyes with what looked almost like alarm. And then he released her and stepped back so abruptly she might have fallen if she had not caught the ladder for support. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, and his voice was rough, scraped raw by something she could not name, and Eleanor whispered yes, because it was the only word she could manage past the sudden tightness in her throat. And he nodded once, curtly, and turned and left the library without another word, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor until the door closed behind him, and she was alone again, standing on the ladder with the book of sonnets clutched to her chest, and her heart racing with an awareness she had promised herself she would never feel again. The second week of her marriage found Eleanor venturing beyond the grand walls of Thornton Hall into the sprawling grounds that stretched in every direction like a kingdom unto itself. And she had taken to walking each morning after breakfast, learning the paths that wound through ancient woodlands and past fields where tenants worked the rich earth, breathing air that smelled of growing things and possibility rather than the coal smoke and close quarters of London. It was on such a morning, with pale golden sunlight filtering through leaves still dewy from the night's mist, that she heard voices drifting from a small cottage set back from the main path, its thatched roof patched in places, and its whitewashed walls showing the honest wear of generations, and curiosity drew her closer, even as propriety whispered that she should announce herself rather than approach like a shadow. But something in the tone of those voices, one deep and familiar, the other high and thin with the unmistakable tremor of childhood fear, made her pause at the corner of the cottage, where climbing roses obscured her from view, and she found herself moving to the window without conscious decision, some instinct telling her that what she was about to witness was not meant for her eyes, and yet was something she desperately needed to see. Through the wavy glass, she beheld a scene that stopped her breath entirely. Henry, the Duke of Thornton, the man who had proposed marriage with all the warmth of a banking transaction, was kneeling in the dirt floor of the humble cottage beside a narrow bed where a child of perhaps 6 years lay pale and small beneath a threadbare quilt, and his fine riding coat was creased where it pressed against the rough wooden frame, his immaculate boots already dusty. And none of this seemed to concern him in the slightest, because his entire attention was focused on the small face before him, with an intensity that Eleanor had never seen directed at anything in their brief acquaintance. A woman who must have been the child's mother stood wringing her hands nearby, her face etched with the particular terror of a parent who fears the worst, and Eleanor watched as Henry reached out and took the child's small hand in his own large scarred one, engulfing those tiny fingers with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands she knew to be so strong. And when he spoke, his voice carried through the window with a softness that made her chest ache. "You must be very brave," he said, and the words held none of his usual clipped formality, none of the careful distance he maintained like armor. "I will send Dr. Morton today, I promise you, and he will bring medicine to make you well again. And when you are strong enough, I shall bring you a pony from the stables to meet. Would you like that?" The child's wan face brightened with something like hope, and Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth to contain the sound that threatened to escape her, because this was not the cold man who had offered her protection and respect and nothing more. This was someone who knelt in dirt and made promises to sick children, and spoke with a tenderness he kept hidden from the world like a secret shame. She withdrew before anyone could notice her presence, her heart pounding with a revelation that rearranged everything she thought she understood, and as she walked back toward the great house, she thought of Mrs. Webb's words about locks and keys, about doors that might open for her, and she wondered if she had just glimpsed the first tumbler falling into place. The invitation came on an afternoon when the sky had finally remembered what blue looked like, when the clouds that had lingered for days parted to reveal sunshine so warm and golden that Eleanor had opened her window simply to feel it on her face, and she was standing there breathing in the scent of cut grass and distant roses, when a knock sounded at her sitting-room door, and she turned to find Henry standing in the doorway with an expression she could not quite read, something that might have been uncertainty if such an emotion were possible in a man who seemed carved from certainty itself. "I thought," he began, and then stopped, and she watched his jaw work in that way she was beginning to know meant he was struggling with words that did not come easily. "I thought you might care to walk the grounds with me this afternoon if you have no other engagements." And the formality of the invitation was almost amusing, given that they both knew perfectly well she had no engagements whatsoever, that her days stretched before her like blank pages waiting to be filled. But she understood somehow that the formality was a kind of armor, a way of offering something while protecting himself from the vulnerability of wanting it accepted. She said yes. Of course she said yes. And 20 minutes later they were walking side by side along a path that wound through meadows starred with wildflowers toward the ornamental lake she had glimpsed from her window, and his wolfhound Magnus, a great grey beast with eyes like amber and a tail that never stopped moving, bounded ahead of them with the joyful abandon of a creature who had never learned to guard his heart. The conversation came easier than she had expected, careful still but no longer strained, and Henry pointed out landmarks as they walked, the old oak where his grandfather had proposed to his grandmother, the folly on the distant hill that his great-uncle had built in a fit of romantic fancy, the tenant cottages whose roofs he had ordered repaired last winter, and she heard in his voice the deep pride of a man who loved this land, not as a possession, but as a responsibility, a sacred trust passed down through generations. They had nearly reached the lake, its surface glittering like scattered diamonds in the afternoon light, when Magnus spotted something irresistible in the reeds and launched himself forward with enthusiastic disregard for the enormous mud puddle that lay between him and his quarry, and the splash that followed was spectacular, a great wave of brown water that arced through the air and caught them both before either could react, spattering Eleanor's pale muslin dress and Henry's immaculate coat with generous streaks of mud that dripped slowly toward the grass. Eleanor turned to look at her husband and found him staring down at himself with an expression of such profound affront, such aristocratic outrage at this indignity visited upon his person by his own traitorous hound, that something broke loose inside her chest, something that had been locked away for 3 long years behind walls of dignity and disappointment. And she laughed, truly laughed, the sound spilling out of her like water from a broken dam, free and full and utterly beyond her control. Henry's head snapped up, and he stared at her with an intensity that might have frightened her if she had been capable of stopping. But she could not stop, could not contain the joy that bubbled up from some forgotten well within her, and she watched his midnight eyes shift and warm as he looked at her, watched them lighten to something approaching sapphire as the corner of his stern mouth curved upward in what was almost very nearly the beginning of a smile. "You should laugh more often, Eleanor," he said, and his voice was soft in a way she had never heard it, soft as velvet, soft as a secret, and the sound of her name on his lips, her Christian name, spoken for the first time without title or formality, felt like a door swinging open onto a room she had not known existed. The 4th week of her marriage found Eleanor standing in the morning room with her arms full of white camellias, their petals soft as silk against her skin, and their delicate fragrance rising around her like a memory made tangible. And she arranged them with careful attention in a crystal vase that caught the morning light, and scattered it across the polished surface of the side table in patterns that reminded her of her grandmother's garden, of summer afternoons spent learning the names of flowers and the language they spoke to those who knew how to listen. She had placed camellias throughout Thornton Hall in the weeks since her arrival, in the drawing room where afternoon light pooled like honey, in the library where she still thought of strong hands catching her waist, in the breakfast room where Henry took his coffee each morning, and sometimes glanced at the blooms with an expression she could not quite decipher. And the staff had learned to keep fresh cuttings ready for her, understanding without being told that the new Duchess was slowly, quietly making this grand, cold house into something that breathed and welcomed. She knew their names now, all of them, from Mr. Aldridge, the butler, whose stern demeanour concealed a weakness for the kitchen cat, to young Bessie, the housemaid, whose mother was ill in the village and who received half-days each week to visit her, a kindness Eleanor had arranged with a word to Mrs. Webb, and which had earned her the girl's tearful gratitude and fierce loyalty. It was Mrs. Webb herself who found Eleanor that morning, appearing in the doorway with a household ledger in her hands that both of them knew was merely a pretext, and the older woman's shrewd eyes softened as she watched Eleanor step back to assess the arrangement of camellias, tilting her head with the unconscious grace of someone who had always found peace in growing things. "Those were her Grace's favourites as well," Mrs. Webb said, and Eleanor turned with surprise, because she had not known this, had chosen the flowers simply because they reminded her of home, of before, of the grandmother who had taught her that beauty could be cultivated even in small spaces. The late Duchess, I mean, the master's mother. She had them planted in the conservatory, so she might have them even in winter, and when she passed, the old Duke ordered them all torn out, every last one, as if he could not bear to see them and remember. Eleanor's hands stilled on the vase, and something in her chest contracted with understanding, with recognition of a grief so profound it destroyed even flowers, and she thought of Henry kneeling beside a sick child, with tenderness he hid from the world, and wondered how many other secret wounds he carried beneath that armour of reserve. Mrs. Webb moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial, and Eleanor understood that what was about to be shared was a gift, a key being offered to a lock she had not known she was seeking. "He was such a bright child, full of laughter," the housekeeper said, and her eyes grew distant with memory. "Always running through these halls, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked and why. His mother used to say he had enough curiosity for 3 boys and enough mischief for 5, and when her Grace passed, the light went out of him. Your Grace snuffed like a candle, and his father grew so cold, so distant, that the boy learned to be cold too, learned to lock away everything soft and bright, because softness only led to pain." Eleanor's hand drifted without thought to the hollow of her throat, to the place where a locket had once hung before she learned the same bitter lesson, and she recognized in Mrs. Webb's story the shape of her own wounds reflected back at her, the same terrible education in the cost of caring, and she realized with a clarity that stole her breath that she had begun to care very much indeed what happened to the guarded heart of the man who had offered her protection and respect and asked nothing of her heart in return. The rose garden lay bathed in the amber light of late afternoon when Henry found her there, settled on the stone bench beneath the ancient arbour, with her worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets open in her lap, and Eleanor looked up at the sound of his footsteps on the gravel path to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart stumble in her chest, something unguarded, flickering behind those midnight eyes before his customary reserve settled back into place like a curtain drawn against too bright light. He did not ask permission to join her, but simply sat, lowering himself onto the bench beside her with a proximity that was not strictly necessary given the ample space available, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and cedar and leather, close enough that she felt the warmth of him through the thin muslin of her sleeve, and neither of them spoke for a long moment as the golden light painted the roses in shades of honey and flame, and the air hung heavy with their perfume, sweet and ancient and somehow sacred. "You come here often?" he said finally, and it was not a question, but an observation, an acknowledgement that he had noticed her habits, had paid attention to where she wandered in the quiet hours of the afternoon, and Eleanor felt something flutter beneath her ribs at the realization that he watched her when she did not know she was being watched. She closed the book of sonnets, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover that bore the marks of years of loving use, and she gathered her courage like a woman gathering roses, careful of the thorns, but reaching nonetheless. "Mrs. Webb told me about your mother," she said softly, and she watched his jaw clench in that way she had come to know, watched him turn his face away toward the climbing roses, as if he could not bear to be seen in this moment of exposure. And she waited, patient as the afternoon light, patient as the roses themselves that had bloomed in this garden for generations. The silence stretched between them, filled with birdsong and the whisper of wind through petals. And when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scraped raw by words he had not spoken in 20 years. "She died when I was 12, he said, and each word seemed to cost him something precious. And my father could not bear it, could not bear to look at me because I had her eyes, her smile, and so he withdrew into his grief and left me to learn alone that love was merely another word for loss, that to care for someone was to invite devastation. And I learned, Eleanor, I learned that lesson so thoroughly that I built walls around everything soft within me and told myself that safety lay in solitude, that if I needed no one, then no one could leave me shattered." His voice broke slightly on the final word, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, felt her own ancient wounds throb in recognition of his, and she did not offer comfort or platitudes or any of the hollow phrases people spoke in the face of grief, because she knew how useless such words were, how they fell like stones into the bottomless well of loss. "I understand," she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "I learned that to be loved was to be left, that promises were merely pretty words that meant nothing when weighed against fortune, and it seemed safer not to hope, safer to expect nothing and therefore never be disappointed." Their eyes met, grey finding blue in the golden light, and something passed between them that needed no words, a recognition of kindred wounds, of parallel sorrows, of two hearts that had learned the same bitter lessons and built the same careful walls. He reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away, and his fingers, those large, capable fingers with the thin scar across the left palm, touched the hollow of her throat with a gentleness that stole her breath, touched the place where she always reached when her heart was guarding itself, and his voice was soft as velvet when he asked, "What did you lose?" And so she told him everything. The locket that had held a miniature of her grandmother, given to Clarence as a token of her trust and her hope, returned to her with cruel laughter at the midsummer ball, when he announced his engagement to another, when he spoke those words that still echoed in her nightmares about pretty faces and empty pockets, when she learned that her worth had been measured in pounds sterling and found wanting. And Henry listened without interruption, his hand still resting warm against her throat, his eyes darkening to midnight, with an anger that was not directed at her, but at the man who had taught her that love was a transaction and she was insufficient currency. And when she finished speaking, he said nothing, only drew her hand into his and held it as the roses swayed around them and the afternoon light deepened toward gold. The midsummer ball rose before Eleanor like a spectre from her darkest memories, its blazing chandeliers and swelling orchestra reaching out through the grand entrance to pull her back 3 years to the night when her heart had shattered on these very marble floors, and she stood frozen at the threshold with Henry's arm beneath her gloved fingers, while the heat of 1,000 candles pressed against her skin, and the familiar strains of a waltz wound through the perfumed air like a serpent waiting to strike. She had dressed with particular care this evening, armoring herself in a gown of silver-grey silk that cascaded like moonlight over water, its color chosen to match her eyes, and to remind herself that she was no longer the naive girl who had stood in this ballroom believing in promises whispered by a man who measured love in ledgers. And at her wrist, the sapphire bracelet caught the candlelight and scattered it in fragments of blue fire, his mother's bracelet, a talisman against the ghosts that waited for her beyond these doors. Henry glanced down at her as they paused at the entrance, and she felt rather than saw the slight furrow between his brows, the way his midnight eyes swept her face with an attention that missed nothing, and when he spoke his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "You are trembling," he said, and it was not accusation but observation, concern wrapped in his characteristic economy of words. And Eleanor forced her lips into something approximating a smile, even as her hand drifted without conscious thought toward the hollow of her throat, toward the place where courage should rest, but where only old wounds lived. The ballroom opened before them, like the maw of some glittering beast, and Eleanor felt every eye turn toward them as they descended the stairs, felt the whispers ripple outward like stones cast into still water. There she is. The Ashworth girl, can you believe it? A duchess now. And after everything that happened, after Pemberton threw her over so publicly, and she lifted her chin and let her spine straighten into the posture her mother had taught her, the carriage of a woman who had learned to bear invisible weight with grace. The heat was oppressive, thick with the scent of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume, and the press of too many bodies in too fine clothing, and Eleanor navigated the crowd on Henry's arm with the careful precision of a soldier crossing a battlefield, nodding to acquaintances, accepting congratulations on her marriage with murmured thanks, all while her heart hammered against her ribs, and the music swelled around her in melodies that haunted her nightmares. She did not see him approach. One moment she was accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman, and the next a voice like honeyed poison was sliding into her ear, a voice she had once believed spoke only truth, and Lord Clarence Pemberton stood before her with his golden hair artfully arranged and his pale blue eyes, calculating her new worth with the same cold precision he had once used to dismiss her. "Your Grace," he said, and the title dripped from his lips like something stolen. "What an unexpected pleasure to see you return to society in such elevated circumstances. We were such dear friends once, were we not? Such intimate friends. And I confess I have thought of you often in the years since we last spoke." Eleanor's hand flew to her throat before she could stop it, her fingers seeking the locket that was no longer there, and she felt the old wound tear open beneath her breastbone as Augusta Pemberton watched from across the room with eyes like chips of bitter ice, and the ballroom spun around her in a blur of light and music and the suffocating weight of memory. Henry materialized at her side like a storm made flesh, and Eleanor felt the change in him before she saw it. The air around them seemed to crystallize, to sharpen into something dangerous and cold, and when she turned to look at him, she found that the man who had held her hand in the rose garden and spoken of loss with a breaking voice had vanished entirely, replaced by something ancient and terrible, a duke in the truest sense of the word, a man whose ancestors had commanded armies and toppled kingdoms, and whose midnight eyes had gone so dark they seemed to swallow the candlelight itself. Clarence must have seen it too, must have felt the predator's gaze settle upon him like the shadow of a blade, because his honeyed smile faltered, and his pale blue eyes flickered with something that might have been fear, though he was too much a fool to heed the warning, too convinced of his own charm to recognize the danger that stood before him in immaculate evening dress, with hands that could break him without effort. "Lord Pemberton," Henry said, and his voice was ice-given sound, frost crystallizing on every syllable, pitched low enough that only those nearest could hear, yet somehow carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I could not help but overhear your conversation with my wife, and I find myself curious about the nature of this intimate friendship you claim to have shared, curious and deeply concerned, for I was under the impression that a gentleman does not speak of a lady in such terms, particularly when that lady is the Duchess of Thornton, and that gentleman is a man whose own marriage is the subject of considerable speculation regarding its notable lack of warmth or issue." The silence that fell upon the ballroom was complete, a held breath that seemed to encompass every glittering figure in attendance, and Eleanor watched the colour drain from Clarence's handsome face as he realized, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, that he had miscalculated catastrophically, that the woman he had discarded as worthless was now protected by a man who could destroy him with a word, a glance, a subtle withdrawal of social favour that would leave him ruined in ways his fortune could never repair. Henry did not raise his voice. He did not need to, for power of his magnitude required no volume, only presence. And when he continued speaking, each word fell like a stone into the terrible silence. "I suggest you consider very carefully how you speak of my wife in future, my lord, for I am not a man who forgets insults, and I am not a man who forgives them. Any slight against the Duchess of Thornton is a slight against me personally, and I trust I need not explain what consequences such a slight might carry." Clarence opened his mouth as if to respond, but no sound emerged, and after a moment he simply bowed, stiffly, and retreated into the crowd like a cur with its tail between its legs, and Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of old shame and fear that had lived there for 3 years, finally beginning to unravel. Then Henry turned to her, and the transformation was breathtaking. The ice in his eyes melted to sapphire warmth, his voice dropping from cold command to velvet tenderness, and he extended his hand toward her with a grace that made her heart stutter. "Dance with me, Eleanor," he said, her name soft on his lips like a prayer, and she placed her trembling fingers in his and let him lead her onto the floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. And when his arm came around her waist, she felt not the formal distance of their wedding dance, but something new, something fierce, and protective and reverent. His hand splayed warm against her back, as if he could shield her from every hurt the world might offer, and as they moved together through the candlelight, she saw the faces of the ton watching them with expressions of naked astonishment, saw them witnessing the cold Duke of Thornton gaze upon his wife as though she were the only star in an empty sky. And Eleanor thought that perhaps this was what vindication tasted like. Not bitter triumph, but something sweeter, something that felt remarkably like hope. The carriage swayed through streets that had grown treacherous with the first lashing sheets of rain, and Eleanor sat across from Henry in the velvet-lined darkness, while lightning split the sky beyond the rain-streaked windows and illuminated his face in brief, brilliant flashes that revealed the tension still carved into every line of his features, the jaw that remained clenched as though he were holding back words that might shatter something fragile between them, and she found that her hands were trembling in her lap, trembling with the aftershock of what had transpired in that glittering ballroom, with the memory of his voice turned to ice and his eyes gone dark as midnight seas, and the way he had looked at Clarence Pemberton, as though contemplating the precise method of his destruction. "Thank you," she whispered into the thunder-heavy silence, and her voice cracked on the words like something breaking open, like a door long sealed finally giving way. "Henry, I do not know how to thank you for what you did, for standing between me and—" But he cut her off with a sound that was almost a growl, low and rough in the darkness, and when lightning flashed again, she saw that his hands had curled into fists upon his thighs, the knuckles white with the force of his restraint. "No one will ever speak to you that way again," he said, and his voice was fierce with a fury that seemed to burn beneath the surface of his control, barely contained, barely leashed. "Not while I draw breath, Eleanor. I would see him ruined. I would see him cast out from every drawing-room in England. I would—" He stopped himself, drew a ragged breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something raw, something that scraped against her heart like a confession. "Tell me," he said, and it was not a command but a plea wrapped in velvet darkness. "Tell me what he did to you. I heard whispers. I saw your face when he approached. But I would hear it from your lips. All of it, if you can bear to speak of it." And so Eleanor told him. There in the swaying carriage with the storm raging around them, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar filling the close space between them, told him of the promises Clarence had whispered in moonlit gardens, of the understanding she had believed existed between them, of the night 3 years ago when she had stood in that same ballroom and heard him announce his engagement to Augusta Stratton, while she stood close enough to see the cruel amusement in his pale blue eyes, and when she repeated his words, "Surely you did not think I was serious? A man of my position requires a wife of fortune. You were merely pleasant company while I waited for better prospects." Henry made a sound like something wounded, and his fists clenched so tightly she feared he might draw blood from his own palms. "He is a fool," Henry said when she had finished, and his voice was quiet now, quiet and certain, and filled with something that made her breath catch. "He held treasure in his hands and threw it away for dross, and he will spend the rest of his miserable life knowing what he lost while I—" But he stopped himself again, looked away toward the rain-lashed window, and Eleanor felt the words he had not spoken hanging in the air between them, like lightning waiting to strike. Later, alone in her chambers while the storm broke fully over Thornton Hall and thunder shook the ancient walls, Eleanor stood at her window and watched the lightning illuminate the grounds in brilliant flashes of silver and shadow, and she pressed her hand to her heart and finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been fleeing since the moment he caught her on the library ladder, since the moment she heard him speak gently to a sick child, since the moment he laughed at his mud-splattered wolfhound and looked at her as though her joy was a gift beyond price. She was falling in love with her husband, falling helplessly and completely, and the man who had promised to ask nothing of her heart was claiming it nonetheless, patient as the tide, impossible to resist. The weeks that followed the midsummer ball unfolded like the slow unfurling of summer roses, each day bringing new warmth that had nothing to do with the golden sunshine streaming through the tall windows of Thornton Hall, and everything to do with the way Henry's eyes sought hers across crowded rooms, the way his hand found the small of her back when they walked together through the grounds, the way his fingers lingered against hers when he passed her a book he had discovered in the library and thought she might enjoy. A volume of poetry, a treatise on botany. Once a novel he claimed to have found tedious but suspected she would adore. And he was right. He was always right, as though he had made a study of her preferences and committed them to memory with the same meticulous attention he devoted to the management of his estates. Eleanor found herself doing the same, learning the particular way he took his tea, ensuring that cook prepared the roast lamb with rosemary that made his eyes soften with unguarded pleasure, arranging his study with fresh flowers that would not overpower the sandalwood and cedar scent she had come to associate with safety and something far more dangerous than safety, and when their hands brushed over the breakfast table, or their shoulders touched as they stood together watching the sunset paint the grounds in shades of amber and rose, neither of them pulled away, neither of them acknowledged the electricity that crackled in the space between them, and yet both of them felt it, a current running beneath every glance and every carefully casual touch. Mrs. Webb observed these developments with knowing eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and one afternoon she found Eleanor in the morning room arranging white camellias in a crystal vase, flowers from the hothouse, for the garden camellias had not yet bloomed, and she paused in the doorway with an expression of quiet satisfaction before crossing to stand beside the new Duchess. "He has never brought anyone to the rose garden, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft with the weight of decades of devotion to the man she had watched grow from a laughing boy to a guarded duke. "Not once in 20 years, not since his mother passed. Remember that, when you wonder what you mean to him." Eleanor's hands stilled on the delicate petals, her heart catching on the words, and before she could respond, Mrs. Webb had slipped away with the discretion of a woman who understood that some truths needed time to take root. It was 3 days later that Eleanor walked to the rose garden in the slanting light of late afternoon and stopped at the entrance as though she had walked into a dream. For there among the roses his mother had planted, the roses he had tended with his own hands for 20 years, she saw gardeners carefully settling new plants into the rich dark earth, plants with glossy green leaves and the promise of white blooms, and she recognized them instantly, knew them in her bones. White camellias, dozens of them, being woven into the fabric of this sacred space, and she remembered mentioning them once, only once in passing, weeks ago, saying that her grandmother had grown them and that their scent reminded her of childhood and love. And he had listened, he had remembered, he had ordered them brought from 3 counties away, and planted them here where his heart lived. And Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth as tears pricked her eyes, understanding at last that Henry Blackwell spoke his love not in words, but in camellias planted in moonlight, in books left on her pillow, in the fierce protection of his presence, and the tender restraint of his touch, and her heart, the heart she had promised to guard, cracked open like a bud reaching toward the sun. Sleep would not come, had not come for hours, and Eleanor lay in her chambers listening to the wind rise beyond the windows, and feeling the restlessness that had plagued her for days, now coiled tighter and tighter in her chest, until she could bear the stillness no longer, until she threw back the covers and wrapped herself in a dressing gown of pale silk, and slipped barefoot into the darkened corridors of Thornton Hall, telling herself she sought only air, only movement, only escape from the thoughts that circled endlessly through her mind like leaves caught in a whirlwind. But her feet knew where they were taking her, had known from the moment she rose from her sleepless bed, and she did not fight them, did not pretend surprise when she found herself standing before the library doors, the library where he had caught her on the ladder, where his hands had spanned her waist and his breath had stirred the hair at her temple, and everything between them had shifted into something neither of them had named. She pushed open the door and saw him immediately, a dark silhouette against the tall windows where lightning flickered in the distance, his broad shoulders outlined against the approaching storm, a glass of brandy held loosely in his hand, though she could tell from its level that he had not drunk from it, and when he turned at the sound of her entrance his eyes found hers across the shadowed room, and she felt the impact of his gaze like a physical blow, like lightning striking the earth. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice was rough as velvet, raw as an open wound. "Why are you not abed?" She moved further into the room, drawn toward him as iron to lodestone, as the tide to the moon, and she heard herself answer, in a voice she barely recognized, "I could not sleep. I do not know why." But she knew. God help her, she knew exactly why. Knew it in the racing of her pulse, and the heat that bloomed beneath her skin, and the ache that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. And from the way his jaw clenched, she understood that he knew she was lying, and knew the truth she concealed. He set down the untouched brandy, and crossed toward her with slow, deliberate steps that seemed to take an eternity, and when he stopped, he was close enough that she could smell sandalwood and cedar and leather, close enough that she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw and the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice was strained with the effort of control. "Eleanor," he said again, and the word seemed torn from somewhere deep in his chest. You should go back to your chambers." She lifted her eyes to his, those midnight eyes that had gone dark as the storm-heavy sky beyond the windows, and she whispered, "Should I?" The question hung between them, fragile and devastating, and she watched him struggle, watched the war play out across his features as thunder rolled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to lash against the glass, and for one endless moment she thought he would close the distance between them, thought he would finally shatter the careful restraint that had governed every touch and every glance. But instead, he stepped back, his chest heaving as though he had run a great distance, his control visibly fraying at the edges, and without another word, he turned and strode from the library, leaving her standing alone in the lightning-lit darkness, her hand pressed to her heart, both of them trembling with everything that remained unspoken. The afternoon sun emerged from behind the last retreating clouds like a blessing bestowed upon the rain-washed world, and Eleanor stood at her window, watching the grounds of Thornton Hall glisten with diamond droplets that clung to every leaf and petal. The storm of the previous night now nothing more than a memory written in puddles, and the fresh green scent that drifted through the casement she had opened to breathe in the newborn day. She had not slept after he left her in the library, had lain awake until dawn, painted her ceiling in shades of rose and gold, replaying the moment when he had stood so close she could count the threads of restraint holding him together, when he had looked at her with eyes dark as midnight and asked her to leave, and she had not left, could not leave, and now she did not know what would happen next, did not know if they would pretend the moment had never occurred, or if something had fundamentally shifted between them, something that could not be unshifted. A knock at her door made her heart stutter, and when her maid announced that His Grace requested her presence for a walk in the gardens, Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest and felt the wild flutter beneath her palm, and knew that this was it. This was the moment toward which everything had been building, and she smoothed her skirts with trembling fingers and descended the stairs to find him waiting in the entrance hall, his tall figure silhouetted against the open doors through which sunlight streamed like liquid gold. He offered her his arm without speaking, and she took it without speaking, and together they walked out into the washed clean world, past the ornamental lake where swans glided through water that reflected the brilliant blue sky, past the ancient oaks whose leaves dripped crystalline remnants of the storm, until they reached the rose garden, and Eleanor stopped at the entrance, her breath catching in her throat, for the white camellias had bloomed. Every single one of the dozens he had planted had opened overnight, as though the storm had been the final blessing they needed, and now they glowed among the roses like fallen stars, their petals luminous in the afternoon light, their delicate fragrance rising to meet her like the embrace of her grandmother's garden, like childhood, like love. "You mentioned once that your grandmother grew them," Henry said, his voice low and rough in the stillness, "that they were your favorite. I had them brought from 3 counties away. I wanted—" He stopped, his jaw clenching in that way she had come to recognize as the visible struggle between what he felt and what he could express, and he looked away from her toward the camellias, as though he could not bear to meet her eyes while he spoke. "I told you I would ask nothing of your heart," he continued, and each word seemed to cost him something precious. "I gave you my word, Eleanor, and I have broken that vow every day since, wanting what I swore I would not seek. Forgive me, I find I am not strong enough to want nothing from you." She could not breathe, could not move, could only stand among the flowers he had planted for her, and watch him struggle with words that clearly came harder to him than any feat of strength or will. And when he finally turned to face her, his midnight eyes had softened to sapphire, and she saw in them a vulnerability that broke her heart and mended it in the same instant. "There is a sonnet," he said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, "that I have read 1,000 times since I first saw you reading it in this garden. Love is not love which alters, when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. I did not understand those words until you laughed in the mud with Magnus, and I looked at you and felt the ground shift beneath my feet, until I caught you on the library ladder and held you, and knew I would never be the same, until I watched Pemberton speak to you and understood I would destroy anyone who caused you a moment's pain. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and cedar and rain, and his voice broke on the words he spoke next. I love you, Eleanor. I think I have loved you since before I knew your name. Loved you when I watched you across ballrooms with your quiet dignity and your storm-grey eyes. Loved you more with every day you have spent making this cold house into a home. I ask nothing in return. I expect nothing. I only need you to know that you are loved, that you are cherished, that you are the answer to a question I did not know I was asking. Eleanor felt the tears spill down her cheeks before she knew she was crying, felt them trace warm paths across her skin as she looked at this man who had planted flowers for her, who had quoted poetry for her, who had laid his armoured heart at her feet and asked for nothing in return. And she understood in that moment that every wound she had ever suffered, every humiliation, every night she had pressed her hand to the hollow of her throat and mourned what she had lost, all of it had been leading her here, to this garden, to this man, to this love that had crept up on her so quietly. She had not recognized it until it had already taken root in every corner of her being. I made myself a promise, she said, and her voice trembled, but she did not look away from his sapphire eyes, could not look away. The day I accepted your proposal, I promised myself that I would be a good wife to you, that I would manage your home and bear your name with dignity, and that I would never be foolish enough to hope for love again, never be naive enough to believe that anyone could want me for myself alone, never risk the devastation of discovering that my worth was measured in pounds and found wanting. She stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to smell the sandalwood and cedar that had become the scent of safety itself, and she lifted her hand to touch his jaw, feeling the muscle there relax beneath her fingertips, as though her touch undid something that had been wound tight for years. I promised myself I would not hope for love, she whispered, but I did not know that love would find me anyway, patient as the tide, impossible to resist. I did not know that it would come in the form of a man who remembers my favorite flowers and quotes Shakespeare in rose gardens and looks at me as though I am something precious beyond measure. I love you, Henry. I think I have loved you since you caught me on the library ladder and looked at me as though you had never seen a woman before, since you knelt in the dirt with a sick child and showed me the heart you hide from everyone else, since you stood between me and Clarence Pemberton and made me feel protected for the first time in 3 years. His hands came up to cradle her face, those large, capable hands with their thin scar and their infinite gentleness, and he held her as though she were made of something more valuable than gold, and when he kissed her, it was not tentative, not questioning, but a claiming and a surrender all at once, weeks of restraint dissolving in the press of his lips against hers. And Eleanor felt herself break open like the camellias around them, felt every wall she had built crumble into dust, and when they finally drew apart, they were both trembling. That evening, as golden light softened into amber, and then into the deep blue of approaching night, he led her to his chambers, and loved her with a tenderness that made her weep, his hands reverent on her skin, her name a prayer on his lips, and Eleanor understood at last what it meant to be chosen, to be cherished, to belong completely to another person, and have them belong completely to you. The autumn ball blazed with the golden light of 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, and Eleanor descended the grand staircase on Henry's arm, wearing a gown of deep sapphire blue that matched the exact shade of his eyes when he looked at her with tenderness. The delicate silver bracelet set with its single sapphire. His mother's bracelet, now hers, catching the light at her wrist like a promise made visible. And she felt the weight of every gaze in the ballroom turn toward them as they entered. Felt the whispers ripple through the assembled guests like wind through autumn leaves. But this time the whispers carried a different tone entirely. Not the pitying murmurs she had endured for 3 years, nor the shocked speculation that had followed their sudden marriage, but something that sounded almost like envy, almost like admiration. And when she glanced up at Henry, she found him already looking at her with an expression that made her cheeks warm and her heart flutter against her ribs, like a caged bird finally set free. His hand rested at the small of her back, proprietary and tender, and he guided her through the crowd with the easy authority of a man who owned half of England and wanted everyone present to understand that his wife was the most valuable thing he possessed. And Eleanor thought of the midsummer ball, where she had stood frozen with old wounds torn fresh and new, thought of how different everything was now that she knew herself loved, knew herself chosen, knew that the hollow at her throat where a locket once hung had been filled with something far more precious than any trinket Clarence Pemberton had ever given her. She was dancing with Henry, lost in the warmth of his arms and the sandalwood and cedar scent that had become home itself, when she noticed Lady Augusta Pemberton watching them from the edge of the ballroom floor. And when the dance ended, Augusta approached with a brittle smile that did not reach her pale eyes, drawing Eleanor aside with a touch on her elbow that trembled almost imperceptibly. "You think you lost something when he chose me," Augusta said, her voice low and cracked with a bitterness that seemed to have corroded her from within, and she gestured toward a shadowed corner where Clarence Pemberton stood alone with a glass of brandy clutched in his manicured hand, his golden hair dishevelled and his handsome face bloated with drink and discontent. "Look closer at what I won. A husband who spends my fortune on his mistresses and cannot bear to be in the same room with me. A marriage as cold and empty as a tomb, a life I would trade in an instant for what you have found." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, not triumph, but a distant, aching pity for this woman who had been purchased rather than loved. And she touched Augusta's hand gently, before returning to Henry's side, to the warmth and safety of his presence. And later, when her parents arrived, her father in his best coat, her mother radiant with a joy that seemed to illuminate her from within. Eleanor watched her father's eyes fill with tears as he saw her, saw the way Henry looked at her, saw the happiness that glowed from her like candlelight. And when her mother embraced her, she whispered against Eleanor's hair the words that completed something that had been waiting 3 years to be finished. "I told you that you would see clearly when the time came, my darling. You chose well, and you are loved as you deserve to be loved, and I have never been prouder of the woman you have become." 5 years had passed since the afternoon when Henry had confessed his love among the white camellias, 5 years of joy so profound that Eleanor sometimes paused in the midst of ordinary moments simply to marvel at the life she had built with the man who had once offered her nothing but his name and his protection. And on this particular summer afternoon, she stood at the window of the morning room, watching a scene that would have seemed impossible to the wounded woman she had been. Her husband, His Grace the Duke of Thornton, the man whose stern countenance had once made grown men quail, was on his hands and knees in the grass while their twin boys, Thomas and William, climbed upon his back as though he were a horse to be conquered, their shrieks of delight carrying across the manicured lawn like the sweetest music Eleanor had ever heard, and their daughter Charlotte, 18 months of dark curls, and her father's midnight blue eyes, sat beside them, pulling at Henry's hair with chubby fingers, while he laughed, actually laughed, the sound rich and unguarded, and so different from the clipped formality she had first known that it made Eleanor's heart ache with gratitude every time she heard it. She pressed her hand to the window glass, as though she could touch the warmth of that scene, and she did not realize she was crying until she felt the tears slip down her cheeks. Tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so complete it could not be contained. And she was still standing there when Mrs. Webb appeared at her elbow with a cup of tea and a knowing smile that creased her weathered face into familiar lines of satisfaction. "I told you, didn't I?" the housekeeper said, her voice soft with the affection of years, and Eleanor turned to find those shrewd eyes bright with vindicated faith. "The right key for the right lock. I knew it the moment I saw how he looked at you, Your Grace, knew that you were the one who would open all those doors he had locked so tight. And look at him now. Look at what you have given him, a family and a home full of laughter and a heart that is finally free." Eleanor embraced her, this woman who had believed in possibilities when Eleanor herself had been too wounded to hope, and whispered her thanks against Mrs. Webb's grey hair. And later that evening, when the children had been bathed and fed and tucked into their beds with kisses and promises of tomorrow's adventures, Eleanor walked to the rose garden where the white camellias grew in such profusion, now that their fragrance perfumed the entire eastern wing of Thornton Hall, and she was standing among them in the amber light of sunset when she felt familiar arms wrap around her from behind, felt Henry's chin come to rest atop her head, and his chest press warm and solid against her back, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar surrounded her like a benediction. "I never thought I could have this," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough, with an emotion that even 5 years of happiness had not taught him to express easily. "I never thought I deserved it. A wife who sees me, children who love me, a life so full of joy that sometimes I wake in the night certain it must be a dream." Eleanor turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his jaw, where the muscle no longer clenched with suppressed feeling, but relaxed beneath her fingers with the ease of long intimacy. And she looked into eyes that had softened from midnight to sapphire and said simply, "Neither did I. We were both wrong, my love. We were both so beautifully, blessedly wrong." The sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and amber and deepest gold, and Eleanor stood among the white camellias that had become as much a part of Thornton Hall as the ancient stones themselves, breathing in their delicate fragrance, while the distant sound of her children's laughter drifted across the grounds like music composed specifically for her heart, and she found herself touching the sapphire bracelet at her wrist, not the hollow of her throat where a locket had once hung, not the empty place where Clarence Pemberton's false promises had left their mark, but this new talisman of genuine love, this gift from a mother-in-law she had never known passed down through a husband who had shown her what it meant to be truly cherished. She thought of the woman she had been 5 years ago, the woman who had sat by rain-streaked windows and promised herself never to hope for love again, the woman who had accepted a marriage of convenience with her heart locked away as securely as Henry's had been, and she marveled at how thoroughly that promise had been broken, how completely she had been undone by a man who planted flowers because she mentioned them once, who quoted poetry because he knew she loved it, who had laid his armoured heart at her feet and trusted her not to wound him as the world had taught him to expect. She thought too of Clarence and Augusta, trapped in their gilded cage of mutual resentment and hollow victory, and she felt not the triumph she might once have craved, but only a distant, gentle pity for two people who had chosen wealth over worth and would spend the rest of their lives discovering the poverty of that choice. They would never know what she had found, never understand that love was not a transaction to be negotiated, but a garden to be tended, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing season. Henry's hand found hers as he came to stand beside her, his fingers intertwining with her own in the easy intimacy of long companionship, and together they watched Thomas and William chase fireflies across the darkening lawn, while Charlotte toddled after them on unsteady legs, and Eleanor leaned into her husband's warmth, and felt the last rays of sunlight bathe them both in gold. "I asked nothing of your heart," he said quietly, his voice that low velvet rumble she had come to love more than any music. "And you gave me everything, more than I knew existed, more than I believed I deserved." She turned to look up at him, at this man whose midnight eyes had softened to sapphire, whose stern mouth curved now with easy smiles, whose hands that had once clenched against feeling now cradled their daughter with infinite tenderness. And she said simply, "You gave me everything first, Henry. You just did not know it yet." They stood together as the stars emerged one by one above the rose garden, as their children's voices rang out in the gathering dusk, as the white camellias glowed like earthbound moons in the fading light, and Eleanor understood at last that this was what it meant to be chosen, to be seen, to be loved, not for fortune or connection, but for the simple truth of who she was. Thank you, dear listener, for walking this path beside us, for believing in love that grows from respect and trust, for hoping alongside Eleanor when hope seemed foolish, and celebrating with her when hope proved wise. May you too find someone who plants flowers because you mentioned them once, who sees your worth when the world has taught you to doubt it, who chooses you not for what you bring, but for who you are. And may your own story end, as this one does, in a garden at sunset, with your hand held by someone who would move heaven and earth simply to see you smile.